Have you ever heard something and thought to yourself, I know that's wrong, but I can't exactly explain why? Maybe it's because you didn't have the rhetorical skills to express yourself, or you just didn't have all of the facts at the time. Today's video is one of those cases for me. This video is the start of what may potentially become an ongoing series where I take on various fan theories that demonstrate some sort of flawed understanding of the topics that they talk about. Frequently, there can be a lot more nuance to these topics that these YouTube videos don't cover. So to start things out, we're going to be talking about a somewhat older video, but I feel like given what's happened over the past couple of years, it's best to go over. I am, of course, talking about MatPat's take of Star Trek being fascist. And I know, hating on MatPat is a pretty popular thing to do here on YouTube, but hear me out. The point of this video isn't to accuse MatPat of being stupid. My point here is hopefully just to educate. This video is, if anything, meant to be constructive. Although you're gonna see that's gonna be a little hard because MatPat's video is filled with so many ahistorical and exaggerated claims that I'm going to be exercising a lot of restraint here. And some of you may be wondering why I chose this video from 2016 out of all of the questionable fan theories out there. That I, a channel that focuses primarily on Nintendo and JRPG content, chose to respond to a Star Trek video of all things. Let's just say, yeah. The events of the past few years have brought the topic of fascism into the popular parlance again, unfortunately. And with that, there have been a lot of takes that range from overly simplistic to just plain wrong. And since this topic is so contentious for some reason, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I have cited all of my sources, both on screen as I make claims, and in the description so that you can go back and check the original materials that I drew from. Which is something that you'd think grown adults should all be able to do, but apparently, some people still have problems with that. Focus, focus, focus. Don't attack him. I have also linked Matt's original video for you to watch as well if you want to check to make sure I'm not taking him out of context or anything. I do need to add one huge disclaimer though. I am not a huge Star Trek fan. My enjoyment of the series is about as casual gets. Because of that, I'm not going to focus too much on the correctness of MatPat's claims in relationship to the show, but rather the flawed interpretation of history that he presents. Although I will point out the few cases where I do know that he's wrong about the show, based on the very limited amount of Star Trek that I have actually seen. So with that out of the way, let's just get to it. But before we do, just give me a moment to get changed into something that fits the mood of the video a little better. Told you it was gonna fit the mood for the video. Look, I even brought the green screen back too. So before we get into this, we need to come up with a definition for what exactly fascism is. Matt's video defines fascism as a system where the government controls all aspects of a citizen's daily life, with particular emphasis in the realms of transportation, communication, and the economy, often under the rule of a dictator. And that's the start of our problems with this video. The argument that the Federation is a fascist government is contingent on this definition. But the truth is, while Matt's definition is not necessarily wrong, it's too broad. Scholarship on the topic generally claims that there is more to this subject than just state control over the citizenry. Fascism is more than just a system of government. It's an ideology. That means it's a collection of ideas that are largely coherent, that provide some kind of view of the world, a desirable future that you want to see implemented, and a course of action in order to get there. Fascism is a bit of an exception to part of this definition, as it's often described of not being that coherent, relying far more on emotional appeals and combining multiple ideas that ultimately are incompatible with each other. That's what this clip here is trying to get at.
But I'm trans. How could I possibly be a Nazi? That's a good question. It's almost as if you're an irrational person and your worldview makes no sense. Get out.
Scholars have debated about how to define fascism, and what regimes throughout history even constitute fascism to begin with. So for our purposes, we're going to look at a couple of definitions. For some, this has been an attempt to find some kind of fascist essence, some trait or collection of traits that are common to all fascist regimes throughout history. The most common one is probably this list. You may have seen it before, probably on Facebook. And for the low price of $29.99 on Amazon.com, this list can be yours to display wherever you would like in your home. And yes, I bought one back in the day. Don't judge me. The origin of this list comes from a 2003 article published in the Free Inquiry that claimed that these were all common attributes across a number of fascist regimes throughout history. This list is fine, but it's still a bit reductive. And you can tell based on some of the attributes listed, as well as other aspects of the article, that it's clearly trying to use broad strokes to paint former President George W. Bush as being a fascist, when for all intents and purposes, he was a neoconservative. So because of that, I am largely going to ignore it. We can do better. A more useful list, on the other hand, comes from a 1995 essay written by the Italian scholar Umberto Eco entitled Or Fascism. What Eco realized is that what makes fascism a bit of a hard term to define is that there are common traits, but not all fascisms have all of the traits. And it's even possible for two separate fascisms to share no traits in common with each other, but still be recognizably fascist. Most importantly, he stressed, these features cannot be organized into a system. Many of them contradict each other and are also typical of other types of despotism or fanaticism. But it is enough for one of them to be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. The 14 traits that Eco recognized as being present in various regimes are as follows. 1. The cult of tradition. The belief that all truth has already been revealed, and that no new learning can occur. We just need to combine the existing works into the right combination to find out what we need to know. 2. A rejection of modernism, not in the sense that they reject technology. In fact, fascists were often proud of their industrial prowess, but more so a rejection of the Enlightenment, which they saw as the beginning of mankind's fall into depravity. 3. The cult of action for action's sake. Take action, even without reflection on why you're doing it. Thinking is emasculating under the fascist worldview. 4. Disagreement is treason. Fascism is an irrational worldview that does not stand up to scrutiny. Therefore, dissent must be villainized. 5. Fear of difference, which frequently takes the form of hostility towards an outgroup, making racism on some level key to many of these regimes. 6. Appeal to a frustrated middle class. Fascism preys upon people's anxieties about the world and the pressure that's supposedly being applied by those beneath them in the social hierarchy. 7. The obsession with the plot. The people must feel that they're under attack. Frequently, this is turned towards outsiders, but ultimately at some point it must turn in, which is why the Jewish people are frequently either the implicit or explicit target of these suspicions. 8. The enemy is both strong and weak. The people must feel as if they're being attacked or humiliated by the other, yet, at the same time, they are the superior people who are supposed to win out in the end. This ultimately compromises fascists' ability to fight wars, as they're often unable to gauge the strength of their enemies. 9. Life is lived for struggle. Fascists seek to defeat their common enemy, but at the same time are unable to see a future in which peace is able to reign. This contradiction is something that no regime has yet to successfully solve. 10. Contempt for the weak. Since fascism is inherently about conflict, it needs to glorify strength at all costs and have everyone look down upon those who are supposedly below them in the social hierarchy. 11. Everybody is educated to become a hero. Heroism is not something special, but rather the norm in fascist society, making everyone crave to go out in a blaze of glory, which will often cause the death of others. 12. Machismo. Strength is often correlated with masculinity, requiring a hatred of both women and any form of non-standard sexual habits, namely homosexuality and chastity. Overall, the focus here is upon upholding traditional gender roles. 13. Selective populism. Fascism claims to serve the people, but in actuality what that means is that the individuals are grouped into some form of common will, which then the leader must parse and execute upon. Fascists have nothing but contempt for democracy, even though they often use it to gain power in the first place. And finally, number 14, newspeak, a concept borrowed from George Orwell's 1984, a text that everyone cites despite no one having actually read it. At its core, language must be reduced as a means to limit thought. Unlike modern English, which sees new words come into existence and others require new meaning over time, newspeak is a language that loses words from year to year in the context of the novel. If you don't have the words, it's kinda hard to voice your dissent. So we've got a list of 14 different traits of fascism, but what if we can reduce it down to just one? A singular fascist trait, a fascist minimum, if you might. One of the most cited instances of this comes from the British scholar Roger Griffin, who defined it to be palingenetic ultranationalism. Now, if someone could define what those two words mean, we're good to go. Palingenesis is the concept of some kind of rebirth, like a phoenix, for instance. Nationalism, on the other hand, is a political ideology that sees the nation, however that may be defined, as the center of all political organizing. Ultranationalism, in the fascist sense, is a term that goes beyond that to claim that the nation is inherently superior to all others. So, by combining those two words, we understand that fascism is, at its core, a form of supremacist nationalism that seeks some kind of national rebirth. Adding that with Echo's list, we gain a picture of a nation that is embarrassed by its current state and wishes to reassert its proper place in the world, and does so through a series of self-destructive behaviors in an attempt to control the population by keeping them in a constant state of fervor so that they'll place all of their allegiance behind the supreme leader. All of that being said, perhaps there is another way to explain fascism. This isn't to say that everything we've gone through so far is completely worthless. There is value in what we've gone through, but you can look at fascism in another way. American political scientist Robert O. Paxton suggests putting the idea of a fascist spirit aside in favor of studying fascism as a historical process. In his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, he compared the Nazis and Mussolini's Italy across their rise and fall, noting all of these shifts in belief and rhetoric over that time, and identified 5 distinct phases. Those phases are 1. Creation of the movement, 2. Taking root in the political system, 3. Seizure of power, 4. Exercising said power, and 5. The long term, which results in either radicalization, where it swears off all prior constraints of the normative state in the case of Nazi Germany, or entropy, where the regime settles into more routine authoritarianism as we saw in Italy. Ultimately, the conclusions drawn by Paxton paint a picture of an ideology that was motivated more so by the same things that Echo identified. In his conclusion, he claimed, fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in an uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. So now that we've established a rough framework for fascism, we need to see how MatPat's video stacks up based on his evidence. The answer, in case you were wondering, is not terribly well. As mentioned already, Matt provides a simplified definition and leaves out a number of key fascist traits, focusing solely on traits that come across as vaguely authoritarian, plus a few surface-level aesthetic observations. There are also some errors, which we are definitely going to address. The biggest glaring omission is the fact that the video makes no mention of nationalism in any formal sense. He attempts to do so at the end, but it's very lackluster. The key assertion is that fascism favors the interests of the state, which is also the nation, above the interests of the individual, even if we usually see that done in a manner that just so happens to align with the agenda of the leader. The evidence he draws on to prove his point, though, have some problems. First is the Hitler quote he uses: "Society's needs come before the individual," a phrase that is commonly attributed to Hitler, but has no real evidence that he ever actually said it. Rather, it's suggested as being something Hitler might have said, finding its origins in the book From a Race of Masters to a Master Race, which stated, "Fascism, communism, and National Socialism all share in common the explicit premise that the individual must subordinate himself to society's needs, or as Hitler would phrase it, society's needs come before the individual needs." And okay, that's a bit nitpicky, but it's an important difference to make, especially because the video directly injects those words into Hitler's mouth. The broader problem, however, is the quote he tries to compare it to. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. You could reasonably argue that this is a fascist idea and is similar to Hitler's alleged words. There's a possibility he could have said that, but at the same time, you know who else could have said the same words? John Stuart Mill, the man who literally wrote a book entitled Utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, who Mill makes mention of in his book, is credited with saying, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." He then moves on to a scene from Star Trek Beyond where Scotty invokes what he calls the bundle of sticks proverb, which MatPat claims to be the root of fascist ideology, pointing to the usage of a bundle of sticks as both the iconography and namesake of Mussolini's fascist party, both of which are correct, mind you, but the origins of this proverb are much older, originating from Aesop's Fables, which was written between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE in ancient Greece. I will give credit where credit is due, though, in the sense that he does acknowledge very briefly the way that these regimes don't tolerate dissidents, or how the series seems to always have a form of enemy faction. However, if we are going to hold that there is a requirement for a very specific type of nationalism, one that is focused on a sense of national embarrassment, based on the evidence provided, there isn't much of a case to be made. Moving on, or backward, I guess, since we started at the end of Matt's video for some reason, we're going to move on to talk about the presence of complete control over the elements of transportation, communication, and the economy. First, before we start, I have no clue where the hell MatPat got this definition of fascism, because A, he doesn't cite any of his sources, and B, there doesn't seem to be any literature that explicitly lists these three components. So I'm going to assume he made it up. Ultimately, as I've already said, this definition is a problem because it's so vague. It can be used to ascribe traits that aren't inherently fascistic. Looking at transportation, we see him cite that pretty much every canon ship in the Star Trek universe is built by the Federation, which, okay, that point could be valid, except for all of the other countries that have fully nationalized certain modes of transportation. In the UK, for instance, the Labour government under Clement Attlee nationalized their railway system in 1948, taking all of the trains under state ownership, which lasted until 1996, when John Major's Conservative government privatized the railways. My point here is that the nationalization of an entire mode of transportation is not necessarily a thing that is unique to fascism, nor even authoritarianism. The UK is a liberal democracy. Okay, they technically still have the monarchy, but otherwise it functions like most of the other Western governments. In terms of his arguments for communication, we see a lot of major omissions with what's being said. First is that pretty much every example he uses to show there being control over communication involves members of Starfleet, an organization that, despite not technically being considered one, is structured like the US military, which means that members of Starfleet would be subject to different rules than civilians, including being required to obey those who are above you in the chain of command and being court-martialed. The example involving the presence of Federation-controlled news networks is also insufficient, because while it's true that most authoritarian regimes have state-run news networks, there are also networks like the BBC which, while not fully controlled by the UK government, is still funded by said government, although there are still institutional factors that may keep them on a bit of a leash, as is the case with American corporate-owned media, but that's a topic I've already touched on before in prior videos. The underlying point here is that just because there is state-owned or state-funded media, while not great, is not sufficient grounds to label something fascism. All of that being said though, the economy section is the part that I take the most issue with here. The primary way that he argues that the Federation has fascist economics is by using this quote from Adolf Hitler. Based on that, it's a pretty open and shut case if it's true. The problem is, it's not. Hitler never said this. Don't get me wrong, the quote is real, but it's an incorrect attribution. The origin was from a pamphlet called Thoughts About the Tasks of the Future, written by Gregor Strasser in 1926. Strasser was a member of the Nazi Party, but let's just say his relation to Hitler is a bit complicated. Fascist economics is a bit complicated in general, to be honest. During the early days, as the parties took root, fascists had many radical economic proposals that were pretty in line with what the reformist socialist parties of the time had proposed, such as heavy taxes and the nationalization of key industries. But those were later toned down. To some extent, the argument can be made that these socialist proposals were just used to appeal to the urban working class. But there were times when the Nazis did end up sponsoring legislation that would favor left-wing causes. However, in gaining and actually exercising power, fascist governments were a bit more wishy-washy on the whole socialism thing. Most notably is that in both cases, the Nazis made alliances with traditional conservative parties in their respective countries. This was a gamble for them, but it was one that was taken out of necessity. What these alliances gave them was a path to a majority coalition in government, in a way that excluded not only liberals, but more importantly, the left. Paxton notes, considering the alternatives, however, the left in power, or a military dictatorship, likely to exclude both parliamentary conservatives and the fascists, both sides were willing to make the necessary adjustments and accept second best. For the fascists, it gave them an in towards having an influence in government, and for the conservatives, it allowed them to tap into the populism that those parties had, something that conservative parties had struggled with in this new age of mass politics that they were inhabiting. The critical miscalculation made here was the thought that the conservatives would be able to control the fascists, which unfortunately they were not. More broadly though, when it comes to economics, once in power, fascists all but abandoned their socialist roots. The more left elements of the parties were more or less pushed out in order to cultivate a broad support base from the big business sector. That Gregor Strasser guy that MatPat quoted thinking it was Hitler, yeah, he was murdered in the year 1934 in what is now known as the Night of the Long Knives. In terms of seizure of businesses and the reorganizing of the economy, that really didn't happen on any massive scale. Paxton notes once again, once in power, fascist regimes confiscated property only from political opponents, foreigners, or Jews. None altered the social hierarchy except to catapult a few adventurers into high places. At most, they replaced market forces with state economic management. But in the trough of the Great Depression, most businessmen initially approved of that. In fact, despite all of those promises to nationalize a whole bunch of industries, the Nazis ended up doing the reverse, privatizing industries basically whenever they could. Also, at no point did fascists get rid of the market or private property rights. Fascists actually sought what they called a third way between the free market and a top-down command economy, what they called corporatism, which isn't when corporations control the government. That's called corporatocracy. It's confusing, I know. Corporatism claims that the owning and working class, instead of being in direct conflict with one another, are instead able to work together in order to carry out the nation's interests. However, in practice, this amounted to more or less being a tool used by the Italian fascists in order to crush labor organizations and intimidate businesses. Fascist economics was by no means some market free-for-all, but it was also not some kind of moneyless, top-down command economy either. Ultimately, the parties were quick to drop their more radical socialist policies in order to cozy up with the ruling elites in order to seize power. And once they began to exercise said power, they did little to radically restructure the economy towards anything remotely resembling what is described in Star Trek. So overall, I think MatPats overstates his case massively by ignoring virtually any of the actual scholarship on the topic and instead hyper-focusing on specific elements of the Star Trek universe while making critical errors about fascist economic policies. And I would love to end the video right here, but there is one last thing we need to talk about with all this, unfortunately. In case any of you are wondering about the shirt, it's because Attack on Titan has become a favorite anime for Nazis for some reason, and I've decided that, like Pepe the Frog, they don't just get to have it like that. You can just as easily do an anti-authoritarian, anti-racist reading of the show as you could do a pro-fascist one. If you want more info on that, I highly suggest you check out this video by a creator named Pixel Hipster, who goes over this topic in more detail. Anyway, back to Star Trek. I promise I'm gonna make this quick, so please just hear me out. I took on this video because there's a lot of misinformation about fascism out there on the internet, and I wanted to correct that, but there are some other aspects that I need to touch on. The first is the racial ideology of fascism. MatPat's video doesn't mention that fascists kind of like to turn their people against some kind of internal scapegoat, but in my research, I found something that I need to talk about. Star Trek is a show that has always been on the cutting edge of social progress. This is a world that portrayed humanity as having pretty much reached full gender and racial parity. This was a show that featured a black woman on the bridge of the Enterprise in a fairly important role, at a time where segregation was still very much legal. The show almost had an episode banned in the Deep South because it featured an interracial kiss, which was a huge scandal at the time because, you know, racism. And according to a PBS interview with George Takei, the show's creator Gene Roddenberry supposedly wanted to potentially include having gay characters.
And he said, you know, you're right, I'd like to do that. But he said, I'm walking a tightrope. The interracial kiss was very controversial.
Right, when Captain Kirk kissed Lieutenant Uhura, it was like
A
unbelievable.
black woman. And so I've got to keep the show on to tell the stories that I'm telling, which aren't being dramatized metaphorically on any of the other show. I've got to keep the show on. And that, as you say, may be a bridge too far.
However, we do have to discuss some of Roddenberry's more problematic views, starting with allegations of sexism. In an interview with the New York Post, the main writer for The Next Generation, Herb Wright, recalled Roddenberry as having said the following: "We don't want to infer that it would be a better society if women ruled. Because, as we all know, women are goddamn c***s." Another writer recalled him as having said, "Women will suck the marrow out of your bones." Yikes. There really isn't anything to add to this. These remarks are pretty despicable, and it seems to show that Roddenberry did at some level harbor a prejudice against women, even if those views were not fully reflected in the show. The more damning view, however, is his anti-Semitism. According to the late Leonard Nimoy, Gene was anti-Semitic. Clearly Roddenberry had Jewish associates. Bill Shatner and I were both Jewish, as were others. To be fair, Roddenberry was anti-religion. And apart from being an ethnic cultural identity, Jews to him were a religious group. But I saw examples not only of him practicing anti-Semitism, but of him being callous of other people's differences as well. In addition, there were also accusations of the show employing anti-Semitic tropes in an episode of Deep Space Nine, as well as claims from one of the executive producers of The Next Generation, Michael Piller, who explained the decision to abandon a planned backstory that involved Jewish characters. The orders were handed down not to make Worf's adopted parents Jewish. I don't want to sound anti-Semitic, that's not what it meant. I'm a Jew, and so is Rick, producer Rick Behrman. We were simply afraid of making the Worf character laughable. I do want to make something fairly clear here, that this did seem to be wrapped in a form of anti-clericalism from Roddenberry, rather than racism like it was in Nazi Germany. The focus for modern fascists is partly cultural, but there is a very strong racial component to it as well.
No, Jews are not white. Jews are Jews. And if we define white as European, that is connected with the peoples of Europe, of, you could say, Western civilization. It's really European civilization because it's not just of the West. Jews are not European fundamentally. They have a fundamentally different consciousness, a sense of themselves, and a different story.
We also do have some more bizarre cases where they try to claim that there's a difference between the Jewish people, who they have nothing against, and the weird, vaguely defined cabal of elites that they just so happen to assign Jewishness to.
There is a large difference between the international Jewish community, or aka international Jewry, and the Jewish individual.
None of this is to say that Star Trek is cancelled or anything. Gene Roddenberry is dead. He's not actively profiting off the show anymore. My point of going through all of this is that somehow, despite the fact that Roddenberry was pretty fucking bigoted in some places, he created an extremely progressive show that showed us a vision of the future where humanity had moved past all of their divisions to come together. One that is antithetical to everything fascism stands for. The future proposed by the series is one that is completely and utterly incompatible with an ideology that, at its core, seeks to divide people and transform the country into an ethno-state. This show was not meant to be some grand political treatise that explains how we should organize the world. The show's timeline is pretty laughable in terms of how much it thought technology would advance. Rather, this show is a what if, a look at what could be. If any reading should be taken from this show, it's that all of these divisions between people are artificial. There is one human race, one people, and the sooner that we realize that, the better off the world will be for everyone in it.